When the racist officer Malloy handcuffed and slammed the head of a black woman onto the pharmacy floor, he had no idea the person he was humiliating wasn't just a doctor. She was also the daughter of a former FBI agent who had once taken down an entire rotten police network. But Elise Monroe didn't need legacy or power to fight back. She chose a different path, steady, fierce, and precise like a scalpel, cutting straight into the infected lump festering at the system's heart. What gives an ordinary woman the strength to make an entire power structure step back? Before diving into the story, comment to tell us where you're watching from. When Elise Monroe walked into the pharmacy, she'd been on shift for 28 hours straight. Her left thumb had started twitching from sleep deprivation. A part of her mind was still running through worst-case scenarios for the next morning's surgery. A 7-year-old girl, occipital brain tumor, possible optic nerve compression. If the pre-anesthesia meds weren't administered properly, the procedure could become a life-or-death gamble. She didn't expect any problems. The prescription was clear. Her credentials were in order. The hospital records matched. She had filled medication here at least 3 times in the past 2 months. Everything was the same as it was for other doctors, except for one thing. She was a black woman. The young man behind the counter, acne still visible along his jawline, took the slip and nodded mechanically. Elise handed him both her physician's license and hospital ID, then said, curtly but calmly, "I need this filled tonight. My patient's going into surgery at 6 a.m. Her voice wasn't weak, but it carried the weight of exhaustion. Not from the shift, she was used to that. From having to repeat things that should be obvious. The moment someone looked at her paperwork, he typed into the system, paused, then leaned back and whispered something to someone behind him. Elise didn't look up right away. She already knew this pattern too well. The moment when everything seems in order, yet her presence alone becomes cause for double-checking. The woman who stepped out was wearing a white coat, her blonde hair neat, her eyes openly skeptical. Elise recognized the face, not from memory, but from repetition. It was the social template burned into her experience. A white manager sees a black woman holding a high-dose prescription and instinctively raises a flag. Not about the drugs, about the person carrying the script. "We're having a little issue with this prescription," the woman said in a voice that was both sweet and distancing, the kind that used politeness as a fence. Elise met her eyes immediately. "What exactly is the issue?" No real answer, just more keystrokes. A muttered comment to the young man, a subtle frown, and, once again, the woman, her name tag said Jolene, turned with that familiar phrase, "If you could just wait a few minutes while we verify some information." Verify what? Elise didn't ask. She'd asked before, and had been labeled the problem. She had seen a white colleague lose his physician's license card and still get his prescription filled in 3 minutes with just a hospital ID. Meanwhile, she, who had successfully performed over 130 surgeries, who held certification from the Georgia Medical Board, was still being asked to verify, not her credentials, her legitimacy to exist in that space. She stood still, not backing down, but not stepping forward either. In her head, a timer had started ticking. If she was delayed past 2 a.m., she wouldn't have time to rest before the operation. Even 1 hour of sleep was better than none, but every minute spent standing here added risk to her patient, not due to lack of meds, but because the system didn't trust the person prescribing them. Elise said nothing. She had learned to compress rage over the years, from the time she had to explain to campus security that she hadn't accidentally wandered into the med school lecture, to the nights on residency rounds when she was mistaken for a nurse even with a lit-up name badge. Every time, she had to make a choice, assert her right to be respected and be seen as difficult, or stay quiet and be treated as invisible. And now, at a pharmacy counter past 1 a.m., she was facing that same tired choice again. Racism in this country is a wound that never stops throbbing. It hides in plain sight across every field, even medicine. Elise, as a doctor, knew this better than most. She thought of the surgery waiting in the morning, of other black mothers who had once called her in desperation, after being told by another doctor it was just a stomachache, only for it to end in hemorrhage, in emergency rooms, in the loss of a child, sometimes the mother too. She had read the stats again and again in clinical reports. Black women in the U.S. are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. Even in the med school, Elise still remembered the study that chilled her. Nearly half of white medical students believed black people feel less pain. That lie seeped into prescriptions, treatment plans, and split-second decisions about who got emergency care first. And now, in the quiet darkness of a pharmacy at night, Elise could feel it all over again. The system hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply changed its voice and disguised itself in the language of additional verification. The young cashier was still standing behind the counter, his hands frozen above the keyboard, his face tightening with embarrassment. Elise could see it in his eyes. She inhaled deeply, then slowly laid out her documents again, this time arranging each item with deliberate care. Her Georgia medical license, a hospital ID with a clear photo, her embossed physician number, and a printed patient chart confirming surgery at 6 a.m. She placed them all on the counter. Neat, visible, undeniable proof of who she was and what she was here to do. The young man looked down briefly, glancing at them, but his hands no longer moved across the keys. Elise raised her head just as Jolene returned. The woman didn't check the name on the chart, didn't match it against the ID. She simply looked Elise up and down, eyes landing on the hand holding a pen. That look wasn't about verifying anything. It was judgment, an appraisal wrapped in bias. Elise could hear the familiar thoughts behind it, unspoken but loud in every syllable of her life. Doesn't look like a doctor. Speaks too confidently. Skin doesn't match the title. Jolene picked up the hospital ID between 2 fingers as if it might leave a stain. Elise Monroe read aloud, then turned to the clerk, lowering her voice just enough to pretend it was private, but not enough for Elise to miss a word. This type pretends a lot. Don't trust the paperwork. Elise raised an eyebrow. Her tone remained even, but it dropped half a register, sharp and cold like a blade honed flat. I'm the lead surgeon on an operation this morning. These documents were issued by 2 public institutions and a state medical board. If you need further verification, I can provide an on-call directory or contact the hospital right now. Then go ahead, Jolene replied with a thin smile, offering no phone. Instead, she turned, reached for the desk phone behind her and dialed. Elise didn't even get to ask who she was calling before the next sentence crushed the air in the room. Yes, I'd like to report a suspected case of prescription fraud. Female, about 30, black, name's Elise Monroe. Elise stood still for several heartbeats. That wasn't a caution. It was a charge, decided long before this conversation ever began. She didn't shout, didn't slam her hand down, didn't yell that this was slander. She just stared at the woman, long and direct enough that Jolene was forced to turn back and meet her gaze. And this time, Elise spoke slowly, but with a clarity that made every word feel cast in steel. You just called the police on me while holding official documents issued by a hospital and a state board. Because I'm black? Jolene crossed her arms. I don't judge anyone. I just follow protocol when something looks off. Elise let out a cold laugh. And what looks off? The ID number? Or the pigment in my skin? Jolene didn't answer. She shrugged, one of those shrugs full of quiet authority, the kind that says the system will always back people like her, no matter how flawed their reasoning. The cashier had backed away now, half hiding behind the counter, watching the slow-motion collision of two women like it was something inevitable and unpreventable. Elise bent down and began gathering her papers, one by one, each slip of paper like a piece of dignity torn and reclaimed. She wasn't going to beg, wasn't going to plead, because every time a black person is forced to prove their innocence, the system grows another layer of armor for people like Jolene. "Police are on their way," Jolene said after a few minutes of silence, her tone like she was announcing a train schedule. "Then I'll wait," Elise replied. Her voice didn't rise or fall, but it landed just firmly enough to make Jolene flinch for a second. "But I want you to understand," Elise continued, eyes locked on the pharmacy manager. "If that child dies tomorrow morning because I didn't get the medication in time, you won't just be explaining yourself to her family. You'll be answering to the medical board, the press, and to people like me, people who've carried the weight of this kind of prejudice their entire careers." That wasn't a threat. It was a fact, a truth that more and more of America was being forced to confront. The silent deaths, the systemic delays, the denials that don't come from medicine, but from bias. Jolene didn't reply, but Elise saw her hands begin to tighten. In Elise's head, the countdown hadn't stopped. She had already lost nearly 30 minutes. If the police arrived and detained her, even just for a few hours of verification, the operation wouldn't happen on time. And if that little girl didn't make it, no one in this room, not Jolene, not the young clerk, would be held accountable. But Elise would, because in the eyes of the system, there's only one person to blame. And, more often than not, it's the one who looks like her. It took only 10 minutes for the police to arrive. The pharmacy door swung open with a dry thud, snapping the air in the room into stillness. Two officers walked in with an air of casual detachment, as if they were just strolling through the neighborhood rather than stepping into a situation that carried the weight of both life and dignity. Their eyes scanned the space, expressionless, silent, their presence alone enough to shift the room into a new, colder register. Trent Malloy entered first, his strides forceful, one hand hovering near his belt where the gun and cuffs sat, ready for what he liked to call non-compliant encounters. His shoulders were broad, his chest puffed beneath the stiff fabric of his uniform. Malloy didn't need to speak, his posture spoke for him. Trailing behind was Riley Shaw, a younger face, less seasoned eyes, the kind that couldn't quite mask uncertainty. He still clutched his radio, though every frequency in the room now buzzed with only one signal: obey. Jolene stepped out from behind the counter like a prosecutor leading a charge. She pointed at Elise and spoke with the tone of someone reporting a bank robbery. "She's impersonating a doctor to commit prescription fraud. I checked. Her insurance info doesn't match. She's clearly using someone else's credentials. This needs to be dealt with immediately." Elise stood upright, her body steady like someone balancing on ice, trying not to crack. She knew this kind of accusation. She'd seen it weaponized dozens of times to justify suspicion, overreach, and the refusal to believe that a black person could be qualified, legal, or real. "I'm a neurosurgeon at St. Raphael's Hospital," Elise said, enunciating every word as she held out her ID. "This prescription is for a 7-year-old girl scheduled for brain surgery at 6 a.m. My name, my license number, all of it is in this documentation." Malloy didn't need to look carefully. He glanced at the card for a second, just long enough to pretend he had, and looked away, shaking his head. "You should know," he said, voice half threat, half sneer. "Insurance fraud is a federal offense. Real doctors don't wander around at midnight arguing over hypertension meds with pharmacy staff. And real police officers," Elise replied, "check facts before making judgments." He narrowed his eyes. not out of surprise, but because she hadn't backed down. "You're resisting a law enforcement officer," he declared, as if reading off a checklist reserved for black women who speak too clearly and stand too tall. Shaw quietly stepped forward, his eyes drifting over the paperwork on the counter. An electronic prescription form, hospital name, digital seal, provider code, and the words, "Dr. Elise Monroe," printed in bold. Everything was legitimate. Elise didn't need to defend herself. The documents did that. But in this room, the documents that carried the most weight were the ones never printed. Skin tone, facial features, assumptions. And in the short space between breaths, it all collapsed. "Out!" Malloy barked, yanking out his cuffs. "I don't have time for games. You're impersonating, deceiving a pharmacist, and refusing to leave." "I'm not leaving," Elise said calmly. "I'm not committing fraud." He needed no further excuse. His hand clamped onto her wrist. Elise was spun toward the counter, her arm twisted behind her back. She turned instinctively, trying to avoid the force, but Malloy shoved harder. Her head hit the edge of the register counter. The sound was dry and small, but enough. Blood began to slide from her temple, trickling silently down her cheek. Across the store, a black boy, maybe 12, stood near the mouthwash aisle. He quietly pulled a phone from the pocket of his hoodie, the camera aimed at the scene before him. No warning, no fairness, just power pressed down on a woman because she dared to stand tall. The lens shook slightly as the recording began. Malloy turned, caught sight of the phone. His rage flared like a reflex. "Hey, kid," he shouted, "put that down. You're interfering with an investigation. I can arrest you right now." The boy flinched, stepping back. His hand lowered the phone. His face turned pale with fear, not at the threat, but because he knew, if they took him, no one would ask why. He'd just be another black kid filming the police, a label heavy enough to steal his childhood. Elise's blood still moved slowly along her face. She was pressed down against the counter like a threat, like a danger. Her hospital ID slipped from her pocket, hit in the floor, its corner slightly bent, the words "Dr. Elise Monroe" still clearly visible. Shaw saw it, and for the first time, something shifted in his eyes. Beneath the training, the protocols, the silence, something human knocked. He'd studied pre-med once before leaving it behind. He remembered the wait before surgery. He remembered watching patients lie still, waiting for a miracle from the person in the white coat. And now, that person, the one meant to offer hope, was being treated like a criminal in the very place she came to fulfill that duty. Shaw froze. His lips parted, but no words came out. Maybe, somewhere inside, a question had surfaced. Whether standing still right now was any different than letting a child go under the knife without the chance to wake up. But he'd been trained well. Silence is safety. Resistance is a black mark in a file, an internal affairs meeting, a career stalled. And so, he stood still. Outside, the July air clung to the skin like sticky glue. But inside the pharmacy, what stuck to every breath was a colder truth. When justice is decided by the color of your skin, no explanation matters. And in that system, evil doesn't need to shout. It only needs enough people willing to look away. Elise sat in the back of the patrol car, wrists cuffed behind her, blood seeping from her left cheek, her head pulsing with dull pain. The steel cuffs dug deeper into her skin with every bump the cruiser hit along the uneven road. But it wasn't the wound that made it hard to breathe. It was the blinking digital clock on the dashboard. 1:14 a.m. Time was slipping away like floodwater. And every minute lost tonight was a piece of life draining from the body of a 7-year-old girl waiting for Elise in the operating room. Elise didn't know her name. She only remembered the parents crying as she explained the brain hemorrhage. She remembered saying, "I'll be there," We're not letting her lose this chance. And now, in the tight confines of the squad car, her voice came out hoarse but sharp, each word cutting like a scalpel. Surgery is at 6 a.m. I'm the lead. That child is waiting for me. The front seat remained silent. Riley Shaw glanced into the rearview mirror, eyes wavering. But the man next to him, Trent Malloy, let out a dismissive snort, then turned back with a smirk carved in contempt. "Oh, you're a doctor now?" he sneered. "Is this a TV show? You think yelling emergency gets you a pass?" Elise swallowed the anger, forcing herself to breathe. Emotion wouldn't help anyone, not the patient, especially not now. But Malloy's words scraped down her spine like ice. "This isn't a performance," she said. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm talking about real life, a craniotomy, where I am the only surgeon assigned to operate." Malloy shook his head. "You think you're special?" he snapped, his voice sparking like kindling. "I've seen dozens like you. Fake badges, fake degrees, fake nurses. What's next? You want me to believe you're a guardian angel?" Shaw said nothing. He didn't agree, but he also didn't interrupt. Since the moment they stepped into that pharmacy, he'd become a bystander in his shift. The car turned left, heading toward the downtown precinct. Streetlights flickered against the foggy window. Lise leaned her head against the glass, her back aching from being bound so long. She refused to let herself burn with rage. It would only consume the part of her she needed most, reason. But in her mind, an image kept crashing like waves. A tiny child lying on a surgical table, her head bandaged, IV lines running from both arms, a resident hesitating, unsure whether to proceed. In medicine, Elise had learned how to block out fear. But tonight, what choked her wasn't fear. It was helplessness. "Elise Monroe." Malloy barked her name like a reprimand. "If you're a doctor, then you should know the medical system isn't a place for people like you to play angel in a lab coat. Contracts, insurance, licensing, if they don't check out, you go to jail. Simple. My documentation is valid," Elise replied, her voice low but solid. "Jolene couldn't verify it because of a system error, and you didn't even bother to check because you decided I was guilty the second you looked at me." The words dropped like stones into oil-slicked water. No ripples, just the stench of power mixed with prejudice. Malloy laughed, short and sharp. "You know what's funny, Monroe? You talk like you're the victim, like the whole damn world's out to get you." Elise stared forward, tone steady. "I don't need the world to feel sorry for me. I just want to do my job without being treated like a criminal 'cause I'm black." Shaw tilted his head slightly. For the first time, he turned around, his eyes meeting Elise's in the mirror. Something was shifting there. Not sympathy, but a jolt of recognition, because he knew every word she spoke could be pulled straight from thousands of ignored reports about racial bias in the system. But Malloy didn't flinch. He slammed his hand on the dashboard like a judge banging a gavel. "Know your place, Monroe. Say one more thing about doctor and conscience, and I'll add obstruction to the list. Every word out of your mouth makes me want to stack more charges." Elise closed her eyes. She didn't want it to continue. She needed to save every ounce of strength, because now she understood she wasn't just fighting to get free, she was fighting to keep a promise to a family that didn't know. The surgeon holding the scalpel tomorrow morning had just had her head slammed into a pharmacy counter. The cruiser pulled into the police station lot. Malloy stepped out first, yanked the back door open, and leaned in close, voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "Doctor, here, you're just another name on a suspect list, and that list is a hell of a lot longer than your resume." Elise didn't respond. She stepped out of the car, head still held high, even as the blood had soaked through her collar. In that southern town that night, a black woman had just been beaten, accused, and publicly humiliated and she was still thinking about a child she'd never met. And in that moment, even in cuffs, she remained the only person in this story truly thinking about saving a life. Malloy might carry a gun, a badge, and the arrogance of unchecked authority, but Elise carried a vow and the conviction that even crushed by the system, she would rise again. And that was the one thing he would never understand. The heavy door of the police station slammed shut behind Elise with the finality of a full stop. Her back was still sticky with blood. The bruise on her forehead throbbed with every step, and her cuffed wrists had numbed her shoulders. But what sent a chill through her spine wasn't the pain. It was how everyone in the building passed by her as if she were an object without a name. Shaw led her through the hallway. Each step felt like a silent conviction. The eyes of others, the officer at the door, the dispatcher, even the janitor, paused on her for a fleeting second, then turned away, as if they'd seen this scene too many times to register it as something worth noticing. In Elise's mind, her internal clock kept ticking. She had once counted heartbeats before surgery. Now, she was counting down the chances of survival for a child waiting at the hospital. Malloy followed last. He didn't rush, didn't press forward. He walked with arms crossed like a man strolling through his backyard. At the front desk, he whistled and signaled to the clerk behind the glass. "Booker," he said. "Charges: medical impersonation, intent to commit insurance fraud, failure to comply." The clerk raised her eyebrows, eyes glancing at Elise, but no one asked anything. No one questioned how a woman with a hospital ID, a valid prescription, and blood still on her face was being tied to a string of recycled accusations. Malloy turned to Elise, yanked the cuffs off with a sharp motion, and nudged her toward the metal chair beside the booking station. "You get one call," he said flatly. "Use it for your lawyer or whoever can post bail." Elise rolled her shoulders, trying to loosen the ache in her arms, but didn't look at him. She turned to Shaw, the only person in the room who still had a trace of something human in his eyes. Her voice was calm but firm. "I want to call the hospital." Malloy raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Seriously? You still worried about some imaginary surgery?" Elise didn't answer him. She looked at the clerk. "I need to call St. Raphael's Hospital. Neurosurgery. I have to transfer a case, or at least let them prepare someone else. I can't leave that child without warning." Shaw froze. His face shifted. The blank gaze of a law enforcer turned slowly into something else. Confusion, then respect. He didn't speak, but the pieces were clicking in his head. The look in her eyes in the car, the way she never complained about her injuries, and now, given the chance to call a lawyer, family, anyone, she chose duty. Malloy let out a low, cold laugh. "Is this your angel savior act again? You think people will believe a doctor gets arrested for forged credentials?" Elise turned to him, locking eyes for the first time all night. "You know the difference between you and me?" she asked, her voice softer than breath. "You step on others to feel powerful. Me, I don't need anyone to believe I'm a doctor. I just need to do my part so a little girl has a chance to open her eyes tomorrow morning." Malloy was silent for a beat, but, as always, he hid behind his favorite armor, mockery, touching. "Make a note," he called out to a nearby officer. "Female suspect declines legal counsel because she's too busy saving the world." Elise picked up the desk phone. Her fingers dialed quietly, each button clicking like a tap against her oath. After a few rings, a weary voice answered. "St. Raphael's? This is Monroe," she said quickly. "I can't be there at 6 a.m. There's a reason I can't explain now. Please transfer the case to Dr. Rivera or Dr. Lee, if possible. 7-year-old subarachnoid hemorrhage, MRI and CT done. Get prepped. Don't cancel." There was silence on the other end. "Elise, are you okay? What happened? Please, don't ask. Just follow through and tell the child's mother I haven't forgotten what I promised." She hung up. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from too many emotions at once. Shaw stepped forward and offered her a paper cup of water. The small gesture caught her off guard. She didn't take it, just gave a quiet nod. "You're a doctor?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "You already know that," she replied. No sarcasm, just exhaustion. Shaw looked at the floor. He knew she was right. He also knew he had been wrong. Wrong for not stopping Malloy, wrong for not checking the documents thoroughly, wrong for staying silent when everything about the situation screamed that something wasn't right. But worse than that, he realized something deeper. If Elise had been a white woman, he probably would have acted differently. Noise stirred from the hallway, a new patrol shift returning from rounds. Malloy stepped out to greet them, his laugh echoing like he'd just wrapped up something worth bragging about. Elise was led toward the holding cell, but she didn't look back. She had done the one thing still within her power tonight. She had called the hospital. She didn't know if she'd be free come morning. She only knew that if that child survived the surgery, that was the only outcome worth holding on to. And in a system that treats skin color like evidence, placing a human life above personal dignity was already an act of defiance. Elise didn't protect herself. She protected her oath. And Shaw, who had witnessed everything, began to understand. Some people don't need power to force others to reflect on who they are. Elise sat on a metal bench, cold as stone, wrists still bearing the red indentations of the cuffs, shoulders aching from hours in forced stillness. On the wall behind her, a crooked poster listing 10 principles of police integrity hung lopsided, its top left corner peeling away. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, those words felt more like a mockery than a code. An older officer passed by, sighing, not bothering to look at her. The mugshot camera sat to her left, ready to capture yet another black face into a growing database of potential suspects. Elise stared directly into the lens as the flash went off. But deep in her chest, what twisted wasn't shame at being arrested. It was the weight of knowing how easily the system distorted the truth. "Tilt your head down a little more," the booking officer mumbled without looking up from the screen. Elise tilted slightly, not out of obedience, but because the overhead light made her wound throb. As the image was logged into the system, Trent Malloy appeared behind the partition, chewing gum, his jaw working steadily like a man unfazed by other people's pain. "Well, Dr. Monroe," he said with a slow clap against the glass, congratulating himself. "A doctor without valid insurance records. A prescription the system couldn't verify. You think we haven't seen this story on repeat for years?" Shaw stood across the room, leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on the hospital ID Malloy had tossed onto the desk like flimsy evidence. Beneath the scratched plastic, the title was still clear: Dr. Elise Monroe, Chief Resident, Neurosurgery. He stepped forward, voice low, each word sharp as a blade. "You know, she's a real doctor. Valid script, valid ID, system glitch. You knew." Malloy turned, his face tightening. Not from guilt, but from being exposed. His smirk returned. "Yeah, I knew from the start." Shaw froze. Malloy didn't stop. He stepped closer, voice dropping to a whisper meant for two. "I'd heard of Elise Monroe before. A guy at the hospital mentioned her. A small, black woman, fast-track career, chief resident before 30. Women like her? I hate them. Not because they do anything wrong, because they make guys like me feel less." Shaw clenched his jaw. Malloy continued, peeling back his racism with clinical calm. "I didn't cuff her for the prescription. I cuffed her for how she looked at me. Like she wasn't scared, like she thought she was better than the place she was born into. And you know what? It doesn't matter. There are plenty of other surgeons out there." He turned away, as if the life of a child was just collateral in some power play by a man with a badge. Shaw stared after him, chest heaving. The stories his mother once told him came rushing back, of his grandfather pulled over for driving a car too nice, of his uncle beaten for standing up to a cop who groped his girlfriend. The memories curled around him like smoke. He followed Malloy out of the booking. "You're destroying someone's entire career," Shaw said, his voice trembling, "and maybe the life of a child." Malloy paused mid-hallway, then turned, cold as stone. "You're young. You don't get it yet. The world doesn't run on justice. It runs on order. And, sometimes, to keep order, you crush a few who think they're exceptional. No one's exceptional because of their skin," Shaw replied, meeting his partner's gaze for the first time in 2 years. "No," Malloy said with a smug nod, "but no one escapes it either." He walked off, leaving Shaw standing alone beneath a wall of portraits honoring officers serving the community, a wall that now felt obscene. In the back room, Elise was led to a holding cell. The iron door shut behind her with a weighty clang that sounded more like a sentence than security. She didn't know what had just been said, but she knew something more deeply than words. Men like Malloy don't need reasons. They just need an opportunity. And people like her, black, capable, determined, spend their whole lives proving they deserve to be believed, saved, allowed to exist. And when truth is twisted inside the very house that claims to protect it, the real danger isn't the villain. It's the silence of those who knew better and stayed quiet. But Shaw, he wasn't silent anymore. A storm had begun to form, and Elise, though she didn't yet know what came next, sat quietly in her cell, because she had lived long enough to understand one thing clearly: silence is the last thing justice ever needs. 2:27 a.m. at the Savannah Police Department wasn't exactly silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed against stained walls, casting a sterile glow not unlike an operating room. Except here, no one was trying to save anyone. Night shift officers lounged at their desks, sipping cold coffee and chatting lazily about last night's basketball game, as if the world outside hadn't just swallowed someone whole. Riley Shaw walked into the break room with a gait that didn't quite belong to him. There was something frayed in his stride, a subtle dissonance like his mind was racing ahead of his body. His tie hung loose, sleeves rolled up, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the regulated chill in the room. He passed the vending machine, punched a random soda without noticing the label, then sat at the scuffed table, left hand tapping restlessly while the right clutched his phone. The name Elise Monroe hadn't left his mind in almost an hour. He'd checked internal records, dug through her medical licensing files, and even tried to access the hospital system. Shaw had once dreamed of becoming a doctor himself, but walked away from it when he couldn't carry both tuition and survival. He thought he had taken a different road. But now, sitting in front of him, was a woman who had walked the whole path he couldn't, only to be blocked by something he'd never had to carry: her skin. He slumped into the old chair, fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from everything tearing at him inside. He opened the precinct's internal database, a system with access to basic civil records. Elise Monroe. He typed her name, hoping for an emergency contact, a next of kin, anything he could use to raise an alarm or call for help. But every file came back restricted. A cold red banner flashed across the screen. Record protected. Medical personnel classified. No emergency contact. No phone number outside the hospital. He turned to the hospital system but hit a firewall instantly. Those records were locked tight behind admin-level clearance. He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on a blank screen that mirrored his helplessness. Elise sat alone in a holding cell, her blood not yet dry, And Shaw, maybe the only person who truly knew she was innocent, had nothing except the internet. He picked up his phone and instinctively opened Facebook. Nothing. No profile under her name. Instagram. No luck. Twitter. Unused. Her name was too common, too many results. He paused, then tapped into LinkedIn, a place where professionals leave just enough trace to say, I exist. He searched. Elise Monroe, neurosurgeon, Georgia. One profile appeared. No photo, no posts. But the professional summary was surprisingly complete, almost clinical, as if this wasn't a platform she used to connect, but simply to state the facts. Shaw scrolled slowly. His eyes stopped on a single line in her biography. Daughter of Marshall D. Monroe, retired special agent, FBI Civil Rights Division. A bolt of adrenaline ran down his spine. Shaw had heard that name in an internal workshop once. Marshall Monroe, the quiet ghost who'd taken down entire command structures in Texas and Alabama for covering up abuse and corruption. Nobody talked about him much, but everyone in law enforcement knew the weight of his shadow. Shaw didn't hesitate. He scrolled to the bottom of the profile. Under Contact, there was an email. His eyes landed on an email address that ended with the FBI, rare and special. He glanced at the clock, 2:46 a.m., and opened a blank email, typing from a burner alias. His first line read, "They're holding Elise." He paused, deleted it, then rewrote, slowly, deliberately, each word a knock on a sleeping giant's door. Elise Monroe is being detained at the Savannah Police Department. She's a doctor. Is she your daughter? He didn't sign it, didn't add a callback number, just left it as a seed of doubt. Sharp, loaded, impossible to ignore. When he hit send, time seemed to stall for one long breath. The words "message sent" blinked on his screen, but what echoed inside him was louder. Something had just shifted. He had pushed open a door using only Elise's name. Down the hallway, footsteps echoed from the late shift, indifferent. A passing officer glanced into the break room, saw Shaw hunched over the pale glow of his phone. Shaw shut it, leaned back in the chair, and exhaled. For the first time, it felt like breathing meant something. He had stepped out of his silence, maybe too late, maybe too quietly, but he had done it. A few corridors away, Elise still sat upright in her cell, hands resting on her lap, eyes half closed. She knew nothing, but something inside her stirred, a vague but certain feeling, as if somewhere someone had struck a match in the dark. And in a small wooden house in North Carolina, a retired man had just drifted off after the late news, only to sit bolt upright as a single notification lit his screen. He stared at the message, then stood, hidden deep among the old pine trees of the western highlands of North Carolina. The wooden cabin sat still, the thin mountain air calm in every breath like a sedative. Marshall Monroe had chosen this place the day he left the Department of Justice, after nearly 4 decades of chasing shadows within the system, men in uniform who bent the law under the weight of their prejudice. He still followed the news, still read case files out of habit, but he had stepped out of the light, no longer on the front lines, until tonight. At 2:51 a.m., his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an anonymous email, no subject line, just a message so brief it felt like a slap. Marshall sat still for several seconds, his breathing deepening with each word. The final question, simple but devastating, shook loose everything he thought he had left behind. He stood without a word. His steps led him to the cabinet by the fireplace, where relics of his former life remained. A Glock 19, a faded FBI badge, and a sealed folder marked in bold capital letters, Savannah PD. He strapped on the gun, clipped the badge to his hip, and his hands trembled, not from fear, but from something older and deeper, reawakening. His old pickup roared to life, gravel, flying into the night behind him. He wasn't heading to a city. He was heading toward a debt never paid. Savannah had once been the site of one of his most decisive operations. A crooked police network dismantled, a department head forced to resign in the dead of night. He had thought he'd cleaned it out. But weeds grow faster than justice can dig. On the way down the mountain, he made 2 calls. One to Victor Liang, a former senior DOJ investigator who once single-handedly unraveled 17 years of falsified records in Los Angeles. The other to Loretta Kane, former head of the DOJ's Human Rights Data Analysis Division, now a legal theory professor in South Carolina. Both answered before the 3rd ring. Neither asked why he was calling in the middle of the night. They only heard one name, Elise. The 3 of them met at a gas station on the outskirts of Augusta, sodium lights casting a yellow halo over figures who looked worn but resolute. There were no hugs, no pleasantries, just a look, the kind exchanged between people who'd lived in the truth long enough to know that when Marshall Monroe calls, the line between silence and action has already been broken. Loretta opened her laptop, sharp eyes scanning report after report. Savannah's never been clean. In 2012, I filed an internal report on the department, but it was shelved before I could escalate it. Victor flipped through a notebook, then pulled out a county map from his jacket pocket. Last month, their internal affairs chief resigned suddenly. No public reason. Marshall said nothing. His hands stayed on the wheel, but inside, it felt like he was driving an anger that had slept too long. The darkness outside thickened, but inside the vehicle, no one needed light to see their purpose. This time, they weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to expose. And if Savannah had once again chosen to target Elise, then this return wouldn't end in a memo. Elise was still sitting in the holding cell. The wound on her forehead had dried, but her eyes stayed sharp. Every sound outside made her look up, not out of hope, but habit. You learn to anticipate what's coming when you grow up in a system that offers no justice for people who look like you. Yet, something shifted when she leaned her head against the cold brick wall and closed her eyes. A sensation like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Undefined, nameless, but familiar, like the echo of her father's footsteps she never thought would return to this hallway. In Marshall's heart, he'd never allowed himself to believe he'd abandoned the fight. He only hoped that stepping back would give Elise a shot at peace, free from the endless grind of investigations and the burden of racial expectations. But he was wrong. Society doesn't change just because you make room for it to. And now, that silence had created exactly what he feared most. Elise wasn't being punished for doing wrong. She was being punished for proving that a black woman could succeed without asking permission. The truck crossed into Savannah city limits at 4:38 a.m. The streetlights grew harsher, no longer soft glows but sharp steel. Marshall rolled down the window, letting the wind strike his face. He looked out at familiar streets, each corner still etched into memory. But this time, he wasn't here to collect evidence or record testimony. He was here to make whoever ordered Elise's detention confront what this system had long forgotten: accountability. And if this city thought it could cage a black woman simply because her excellence exceeded their comfort level, then Savannah was about to feel an aftershock it didn't see coming. Marshall Monroe was no longer an investigator. He was a father. And that, more than anything, should terrify anyone who ever tried to break Elise. Elise sat on the cold steel bench inside the holding cell, where concrete walls absorbed moisture and the flickering fluorescent lights pulsed like the heartbeat of someone coming out of shock. Her eyes were softly closed, her back straight. She would not allow herself to collapse in a place like this. The chill from the bench seeped through the thin fabric of her scrubs, still unexchanged. There was no visible sign of fatigue. Even though nearly 30 hours had passed since she'd last truly slept. In her mind, her mother's voice echoed, pulled back from some distant place. You weren't born to submit. You were born to prove that intelligence has no color. That line had guided her through nights she thought she wouldn't survive, through hospital corridors that seemed to stretch forever, through all-white surgical panels, through admissions committees that looked closed before she even entered the room. Every step Elise had taken, every title she'd earned was built on clenched jaws, on ignoring whispers behind her back, on working twice as hard to be recognized half as much. She had no right to be tired, no permission to be wrong. And now, with dried blood still marking her temple, she found herself once again dragged into a reality she thought she'd outgrown, accused of impersonating the very role she spent her life defending through skill and sacrifice. Outside the cell, the atmosphere inside the Savannah Police Department had begun to shift. 3 consecutive phone calls had come in from an unfamiliar number with a Washington, D.C. area code. At first, the night shift dispatcher assumed it was the press, but when he read the name and heard the voice on the other end, measured, cold, clipped like steel, his entire posture changed. The call was immediately routed to the duty sergeant, Nolan Price, a man long accustomed to slow nights and trivial paperwork. But tonight, after a few short sentences from the other side of the line, he stood up as if jolted. His voice trembled slightly as he hung up and turned to brief 2 junior officers. A rapid-fire meeting took place behind a closed door just a few steps from Elise's cell. Something had changed in their eyes, like a windless pressure had swept through the building, leaving behind a vacuum no one knew how to fill. A young officer rushed in holding the printed arrest report, his eyes locked on the bolded sender name at the bottom of the page, Marshall D. Monroe, along with an old but still federally validated FBI identification number. He swallowed, not out of fear of the name, but from the realization that this was no longer a local mistake. This wasn't just a mishandled arrest. It had now crossed the borders of a police precinct, leapt beyond the city of Savannah, and was falling straight into the sights of the federal government. Inside Nolan Price's office, a freshly printed fax emerged from the machine. Notice of monitoring. Immediate compliance required. DOJ Civil Rights Division. Beneath the digital signature was a faded but unmistakable seal. United States Department of Justice. Someone muttered under their breath, teeth clenched. We're screwed. A soft ping echoed from the intercom system, a tone not meant for fire or lockdown, but an internal alert signaling the presence of personnel outside the local department. Nolan stepped out and nodded to the officer by the door. 2 minutes later, every networked computer in the central office was disconnected under the notice of emergency maintenance. No one said why, but everyone felt it. Back in the cell, Elise didn't move. Her back stayed straight. Her eyes reflected the glow of the flickering light. And somewhere just 3 blocks away, the sudden screech of tires rolled to a halt at the steps of the Savannah Police Department, heavy as the knock of an era about to be rewritten. The heavy engine cut off in front of the old glass doors of the Savannah Police Department, where July's midnight mist clung to the faded lettering above the awning. There was no thunder, but the air felt charged like the tense stillness before a violent storm. And then Marshall Monroe pushed through the door, not in a rush, not need an introduction, but his presence alone shook the rhythm of the building loose. He wore no uniform, just a gray shirt, a dark coat draped over his shoulders, and a badge that once spoke for itself. FBI, Civil Rights Division, retired. No warnings, no shouting. But when he handed over a folder stamped in red by the Department of Justice and calmly said, "We are here to investigate civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code," the reception area froze mid-breath. The night duty officer's hands trembled as he took the papers, his throat dry when he read the 3 sharp words stamped below the federal seal. Federal jurisdiction confirmed. Behind Marshall stood Victor Liang and Loretta Kane, names known to anyone who'd ever paid attention. One had dismantled an entire police department in Missouri. The other had testified before Congress on federal justice policy. No one carried weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence, composed and piercing, made every officer sit straighter without being told. Sergeant Nolan Price stepped out of his office, phone still in hand from the Washington call he hadn't even finished. He walked slowly toward them, his gaze moving from the folder to Marshall's face, then to the 2 figures behind him. His eyes faltered, though his voice tried to hold authority. "You'll need to state the reason for federal intervention in a standard arrest." Marshall didn't let him finish. He spoke evenly, like a man who had committed every line of justice to memory. Elise Monroe, an internist with Savannah's public hospital system, was detained without a warrant, without evidence, and without identity verification. She is a lawful citizen with no criminal record, en route to perform a life-saving medical procedure. What you've done is one of the gravest constitutional missteps possible. The words struck the concrete floor like thunder. Young officers behind the front desk glanced at each other. A few tightened their grip on their belts, but none moved forward. There was something in Marshall's bearing, so certain, so seasoned in power, that made resistance feel foolish. He pointed down the corridor behind them. "Open the door. Bring her out." For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if drawn by gravity, Price nodded. A younger officer flipped through the intake file and pressed the release. The mechanical lock snapped open with a cold, flat sound that echoed like the first warning shot of an oncoming storm. Elise stepped out of the holding cell, her gait steady despite the weight of 30 sleepless hours and the bruise still visible on her temple. Her eyes didn't falter when they met her father. They didn't embrace. No tears, just a nod, an acknowledgement between 2 people who had walked on separate sides of the same fight. Marshall handed her a bottle of water. Elise didn't say thank you. She turned to Sergeant Nolan, voice hoarse but resolute. "I need a full copy of the arrest file, every document, from the dispatch call to the transfer form." Nolan swallowed. He tried to look composed, but his fingers fiddled with the hem of his shirt. Elise went on, "And I'll be speaking at the press briefing this morning." An officer moved to interrupt, but Marshall raised a hand. "She will speak, as a citizen and as a doctor." The air in the room thickened. Conversations went silent. All eyes were on them, on the father with a stare forged from years in the trenches of justice, and the daughter with a spine tempered by fire. Loretta Kane surveyed the space, her tone calm, that of someone who had seen too many abuses not to recognize one. "From this moment, all activity in this department is under federal observation. Every device is being logged. Every misstep will be recorded." Victor added, without needing volume, "If any document is altered or disappears from the system, it will constitute obstruction of a federal investigation." At the front desk, an officer dropped a coffee cup. The sound was small, but it cracked through the silence like the first lightning bolt before a downpour. Elise turned toward the exit, walking past the officers as though she'd never been a detainee. Every step she took left an imprint on the worn floor, measured, unyielding. As she reached the door, she paused, looked back at her father, and said in a voice just loud enough, "You came right on time. But the rest, I'll say it myself." Marshall didn't stop her. He nodded, and his eyes in that moment weren't the eyes of the man who once taught her law. They were the eyes of a father who understood. The little girl who used to ride in the back seat during stakeouts was now ready to stand in the storm, not to run from it, but to name it. Outside, dawn hadn't broken, but the wind had begun to rise, and Savannah, After this night would no longer be a city that slept quietly. The steel door had barely closed behind Elise when a familiar voice broke the silence from her left, deep, hoarse, as if strangled by guilt itself. Monroe. Elisa turned her head. Under the pale yellow light spilling from the personnel bulletin board, Riley Shaw stood stiff, fists clenched at his sides like a man forcing himself not to run. The radio, strapped to his shoulder, still crackled faintly, but he didn't bother to silence it. He was breathing hard, like someone who'd just sprinted through a storm that had no wind, only the debris of cowardice and wrong decisions layered into a uniform. Elise said nothing. She looked at him, her gaze not cold, not forgiving, just observant. Her forehead still bore the dark stain from where it had hit the pharmacy counter, but the posture of someone who had walked out from the shadows of public humiliation gleamed straight and unbreakable. The silence between them stretched long enough to make Shaw nearly choke on it. I know this can't be called a misunderstanding anymore," he stammered. "I saw your badge. I knew that name. Monroe. I recognized it as soon as you mentioned the surgery this morning, and His voice cracked before it could finish the sentence. Elise stayed where she was, didn't move closer, but she tilted her head, watching him the way a doctor monitors a patient's response to a dose of truth. "I didn't think it would go this far," Shaw continued, his words tumbling out before he could filter them. "At first I thought it was just a mix-up, a bad report, a tense night. But Malloy, he knew from the start. He said he knew you were a doctor, knew your name. He just hated people like you." That made Elise lift her eyebrow. Barely. Shaw inhaled, his eyes beginning to shine, not from weakness, but from isolation within a system he had once trusted to hold him up. "There are things in this department that no one ever files," he admitted, his voice quivering like water under a light breeze. "They call it experience, turning your head, playing deaf, protecting yourself. But now I can't sleep. You were right. A child could have died, and all because I watched." Elise exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to release the weight coiled in her chest. She knew the kind of silence Riley had just described. She'd encountered it in meetings where no one spoke after a black patient was misdiagnosed because the lead physician misread the chart. She'd seen it in the head nurse's eyes when a colleague muttered that a black mother was probably exaggerating her pain. Silence wasn't always avoidance. In some places, silence was survival. But there came a moment when surviving through silence turned into complicity. "You can fix it," Elise said, not accusing, not rallying, just stating it plainly, like a prescription for an infection that had festered far too long. "If there's any courage left in you, speak the truth. Not for me, for the others who'll be treated like me if you keep staying quiet." Shaw looked up, his eyes red but ignited with something that hadn't been there before. "What do you think I should do?" Elise stepped forward, closing the distance. There was no longer a line between the detained and the detainer, the doctor and the cop, the victim and the witness. She looked him in the eye and said slowly, "Go outside, in front of the cameras, in front of the crowd, in front of the colleagues who will laugh at you or shut you out after. And tell the truth." The air thickened. An officer passed by, slowed when he saw them, lingered for a breath like he was weighing whether to report the unusual conversation, then kept walking. Elise recognized that look, the look of someone balancing on the edge between doing what's routine and doing what's right. But this time, he moved on. Maybe because he sensed the order in this building had already begun to crack. Shaw nodded. Not the robotic nod of following orders, but the quiet, anchoring nod of someone who had just crossed into a new version of himself. "I'll do it," he whispered, then turned and walked away. His steps were no longer hesitant, though his shoulders still carried the weight of what might come next, a career possibly ending. But some prices were worth paying. Elise watched him go. She didn't feel relief exactly, but something had shifted. In a system that seemed too solid to budge, one man had chosen to lay the first stone toward an exit. He might not be strong enough to break down the wall, but he had knocked. And from that knock, the door to truth was starting to move. Less than 10 hours after Marshall Monroe stepped into the Savannah Police Department, a black SUV bearing federal plates pulled silently into the back lot. 3 agents from the Department of Justice emerged, carrying locked briefcases, encrypted laptops, and a search warrant stamped in red by the Attorney General. Leading the team was Agent Rachel Adler, hair pulled tight at the back of her neck, eyes the color of unfinished steel, voice low but unmistakably authoritative. When she presented her credentials, the sergeant at the desk could only nod and step back, sweat beading down the back of his neck as if his body had sensed what was about to unravel. The investigative team hadn't come to ask questions. They came to open drawers, retrieve files, and extract internal logs. And the first name they typed into the terminal, like a blade slicing through what had once been presumed unbreakable, was Trent Malloy. Within 30 minutes, the fractures began to surface. Internal reporting logs showed Malloy connected to 3 separate use-of-force incidents over the past 4 years. 2 victims sustained traumatic brain injuries. 1 suffered 4 broken ribs while handcuffed. Each case was internally marked with the same vague explanation: necessary force applied during high-tension situation. No body cam footage, no third-party review, just cold, bureaucratic phrases buried in drawers nobody had touched. One report made Rachel pause. A tattered file, the edges yellowing, the ink faded to a ghost. The complaint came from a 17-year-old black teenager named Darren Fields, beaten by Malloy behind a gas station after being stopped and asked for ID without reason. Darren filed a report, complete with photos of his injuries and statements from 2 witnesses. That file was never processed. Just 3 months later, Darren disappeared. No one found him. The final line in his record read, "Possible runaway, no investigation, no official missing persons file." When Elise reached that sentence, her hand clenched. She closed her eyes. The imagination of a doctor who had seen too many fractured bones and soft tissue trauma wasn't imaginable anymore. It was memory, evidence, injustice, left to rot. In the archive room, the light of the monitor flickered across her face as she reviewed footage pulled from a 2018 bus terminal. An elderly woman, clearly frail, walking with a cane and wearing a thin jacket, was shoved by Malloy during a minor dispute about standing in the wrong spot in line. The shove wasn't violent, but it was enough to send her crashing into a steel bench. Medical records later confirmed fractured left arm, internal bruising. The case was resolved internally. No news, no justice. Elise turned away from the screen. A federal staffer handed her a bottle of water. She took it, but didn't drink. Something was tightening in her chest, not for herself, but for the people who had no one to speak for them. How many walked out of here with bruises on their bodies or inside them, and no one believed them? She whispered. Rachel didn't answer. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the second monitor where new files continued to emerge. Unresolved complaints, dismissed allegations, body cam footage flagged as corrupt. The tech team had begun recovering backups from the department's cloud storage, copies that someone thought had been erased. One technician found a folder labeled Red Line Folder. Inside were archived radio logs, audio clips marked by scribbled notes. Subject: loud, non-compliant, history of disturbance. Elise recognized at least 3 names. Her patients, people who had once told her they'd been harassed by police but were never believed. Out in the hallway, Shaw leaned against the wall. He had submitted a request to be temporarily removed from patrol duty and reassigned to assist the federal investigation. His face was pale from exhaustion, but his eyes were clearer than they'd ever been. He wasn't running from guilt anymore. He was using it to stay awake. Marshall stepped over and handed Elise a printed report from Washington, an early result from a federal audit by independent oversight divisions. The headline read, "Savannah Police Department, flagged for pattern of civil rights violations." Elise flipped through the pages. Malloy's name appeared no fewer than 7 times, each linked to a number, a percentage of complaints left uninvestigated, retention of improperly logged records, and the frequency with which body cam footage went missing within 48 hours of an incident. She stopped at a screenshot of an internal chat between Malloy and another officer. The text chilling in its casual cruelty. "Kid just needs to be scared this time. Next time, I'll make the lesson longer, assuming he shows up again." Outside, the day was growing darker, but in that room, filled with forgotten files and buried memories, a different kind of light was rising, the kind that only truth can cast when it's finally pulled out of hiding. Elise knew that even if justice arrived late, even if not every wound could be repaired, the truth, once out of the drawer, never goes back to silence. And now, the first knock had been heard. The next door would not remain shut. City Hall in Savannah had been prepped since dawn. Blue cloth chairs lined the floor in perfect rows, and cameras from both local and national outlets formed a quiet wall along the side of the room. The spotlight didn't shine on performers, but on suits trying to look composed beneath the crushing weight of public scrutiny. Mayor Jackson Whitmore stood center stage, the seasoned face of a longtime politician smoothed under a layer of beige-toned makeup that did little to mask the creases around his mouth. The way he gripped the microphone, too tightly, just enough to reveal tension, said everything. This was not a press conference he had chosen to host. This was a forced appearance. "We regret the unfortunate events of the past day," he began, choosing each word as if navigating a minefield. "The incident at the pharmacy, as well as recent allegations concerning misconduct by certain individuals within the police department, are deeply troubling. However, we believe the majority of our officers remain committed and professional." Below him, shutters clicked. Some reporters scribbled notes. Others raised eyebrows. One, WSB-TV's lead journalist, quietly replayed a clip on her phone. Malloy slamming Elise into the counter, blood trailing from her temple. "And let me emphasize," the mayor continued, "this was an isolated incident stemming from an administrative miscommunication at a pharmacy. The city is committed to full accountability." He stressed the final 2 words as though sheer enunciation could push back the tidal wave of backlash pressing against the security barriers outside. Then Elise Monroe stood. The metallic screech of her chair was thin but sharp enough to cut through the room. She walked straight to the front, not looking at the mayor but directly into the row of cameras, the stage lights carving deep shadows across her face like chiseled marks in stone. "I have only one question," Elise said, her voice steady without a microphone. "If a 7-year-old girl had died on the operating table this morning because her surgeon was unlawfully detained, which of you would have signed her death certificate?" A wave of silence crashed through the room. To the right, where the city's legal team was seated, movement halted. Mayor Whitmore leaned back slightly, as if doused in cold water. His fingers tensed, but no rehearsed phrase could absorb the blow. This wasn't a personal outburst. This was moral reckoning. Elise turned, eyes unwavering. "Don't call this a misunderstanding. Don't use neutral language to dilute responsibility when an innocent woman was assaulted, humiliated, and stripped of her chance to save a life, simply because her skin color made it hard for others to believe she could be a doctor." Her words demanded no blood, no vengeance, just the courage to look directly. and that, for those trained to avert their eyes, was the hardest task. A comms staffer gave a discreet nod to a CNN cameraman. The lens zoomed in on Elise. Across the country, in cafes and living rooms with televisions already on, viewers began to understand. This wasn't a story about wrongful arrest. This was a story about the price of silence that lingers too long. Mayor Whitmore regained his posture, his tone lower now, stripped of flourish and heavy with defense. "We are initiating an independent review, and if misconduct is confirmed," Elise cut in, gaze steady. "Her name is Mia. She has a cerebral arteriovenous malformation. There was a 5-hour window to operate. That surgery was delayed. Right now, the team is fighting minute by minute to keep her alive." In the back, a city staffer lowered his head. Another bit her lip. And the mayor, a man used to turning errors into bureaucratic phrasing, found himself, for the first time in the press conference, truly speechless. A cough echoed from the far corner. A chair creaked, but no one spoke. Elise stepped back from the podium, not waiting for applause, not seeking affirmation. She had said her piece, and it was sharp enough to shred every justification that might follow. The cameras kept rolling. Online, the clip went viral within 15 minutes. Headlines flashed. "Black Doctor Confronts Savannah Mayor Over Child's Life." In the back office behind the hall, Marshall Monroe watched the live stream in silence. His eyes never left his daughter's image. A DOJ agent stepped forward with a printed briefing of the next procedural steps, but Marshall raised a hand, not yet ready to take it. "They need to hear her," he said, "not me." And indeed, while officials scrambled to reframe their talking points, outside, where crowds held signs reading, "I stand with Dr. Monroe," the question Elise had left behind echoed like a hammer striking the city's heart. What is the cost of prejudice? And how many innocent children have already paid it? 3 days after the press conference, a civil complaint titled "Monroe v. Savannah Police Department" circulated through every federal office in the chain. Elise Monroe's name was no longer tied to blood trailing down her temple or a steel chair in a holding cell. It now signaled something deeper. A decisive blow against a decades-old machine of unchecked power embedded in the American system. Elise didn't wait for the headlines to fade. She walked into civil rights attorney Marcus Dean's office early that morning, carrying a stack of internal investigation files the DOJ had granted her access to. On the table lay piles of documents, blurred payroll records, inconsistent disciplinary memos, missing persons files no one had ever pursued. With each page turned, the air grew heavier. Marcus looked up at her. "If we file with all of this, Elise, there's no walking it back." She answered with a slow nod, eyes cold and clear, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd long accepted that retreat was never an option for someone like her, a woman once dragged from a pharmacy under indifferent stares and the slow drip of blood down her cheek. The suit named 3 key demands: permanent federal oversight of the Savannah Police Department, reparations for all verified victims of abuse, and the creation of a civilian oversight council with veto power in recruitment and internal review. It wasn't just legal language. It was a voice for dozens whose names had been buried in silence. Elise wasn't alone. When the list of co-plaintiffs was released, the name that shook the city was Riley Shaw, the same officer who had once stood in the lineup that arrested her, now signing alongside her in the law office, pen in hand. His face was pale that day, but his grip was steady. As he looked at Elise while signing his name, it was both an apology and a vow. Media erupted. National outlets ran headlines like, "Wrongfully detained Dr. Sue's entire Savannah PD, joined by fellow officer." But the ripple went beyond news cycles. In Charleston, a group of young lawyers reopened over 300 complaints once closed for lack of evidence. In Baton Rouge, law students launched a campaign educating citizens on their constitutional rights during police questioning. And in Los Angeles, the mother of a young man who had died in custody quietly reached out to Elise's office, hoping to add her son's name to the list of future witnesses. A wave was forming, not loud but seismic. Local governments were forced to hold public hearings. Multiple states began reviewing policies surrounding internal affairs divisions, long seen as armor shielding misconduct disguised as internal discipline. For Elise, none of this happened in silence. She attended every session, every deposition, every closed-door conversation with city representatives. At one such meeting with the Georgia state delegation, she said bluntly, "I'm not asking for a perfect system. I'm asking that if someone like me, a licensed, board-certified doctor with a record of saving lives, can still be seen as suspicious just because of her skin, then that system needs to be dismantled piece by piece." Her words didn't create tension. They created silence. And that silence was finally filled with listening. Marshall Monroe stood beside his daughter at every proceeding, but he spoke little. Only once, when asked how it felt to see his daughter become the face of a movement, did he say, "I taught my child that the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs someone brave enough to say it where no one else will." Today, she did. The preliminary hearing at the federal court in Atlanta was scheduled for the following week. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered, not in fury, not in chaos, but in quiet unity, holding signs that read, "Accountability is not optional." As Elise entered the grand lobby, Riley walked beside her. Marcus Dean followed close behind, and Marshall remained outside in the crowd, slowly removing his cap like a veteran sending warriors into battle. And in that moment, as the courthouse doors closed behind her, Elise understood. This was no longer about reclaiming her name. This was about opening a path for thousands who had never even been called by theirs. They didn't need to shout. They needed to be right. And this time, leading them was a black woman, a doctor, the daughter of a former federal agent who once rooted out darkness from rooms just like this. She walked forward, one step at a time, carrying stories untold, dreams interrupted, and a belief growing stronger with every reopened file. Justice doesn't arrive on its own. It's built by those who dare to begin. The federal courtroom in Atlanta wasn't large, but that morning, the air inside felt dense, like concrete resting squarely on the chest of every person present. Just over 40 people sat in on the preliminary hearing. Legal representatives, DOJ officials, and a limited number of accredited reporters. Elise sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on the witness stand where Trent Malloy had just entered, dressed in a steel blue suit pressed too perfectly for a man who once believed himself untouchable by the law. There was no longer the heavy stomp of boots on tiled floors, no trace of the cold, dismissive smirk he used to wear like a badge. Malloy moved slowly, casting glances around the room as if he already knew what waited for him in every stare. Across the aisle, Riley Shaw had arrived early, his police uniform replaced by a plain button-down. As Malloy passed by, Shaw didn't flinch. Their eyes met, and in Shaw's gaze was something close to regret, but not fear. Judge Margaret Kilner, known across Georgia for her fairness and uncompromising clarity, presided from the bench. Her eyes moved across the stack of documents laid out before her, video recordings, transcribed interviews, written testimony. She knew this was no ordinary hearing. This was a moment of reckoning, where the machinery of power, once misused, was being dragged out into the open. The plaintiff calls its first witness, Dr. Elise Monroe. A quiet fell over the room. Elise stepped to the stand. She didn't need notes. Her story had embedded itself into her memory like scar tissue, impossible to forget, even without prompting. And yet, as she stood across from Malloy, the man who had cuffed her, who had driven her head into the pharmacy counter, her heart still beat differently. "Please, describe the reason you were at the pharmacy that night." Her answer came clean, each word deliberate, like an incision drawn with a surgeon's hand. "I had just finished a 28-hour shift. I was picking up medication required for a pediatric neurosurgery the following morning. The patient was a 7-year-old girl with a rare cerebral arteriovenous malformation." The room seemed to hold its breath. Elise continued, recounting the events from start to finish. The narrowed eyes of Manager Jolene, the indifferent stare of Malloy, the condescension in his voice as he dismissed every credential she presented and every attempt she made to explain. "I told him that if I wasn't in the OR by 6 a.m., that child might not survive. He said I was performing." Judge Kilner paused, then looked directly at Malloy. "Does the defendant wish to respond to this statement?" Malloy didn't stand. The man who once wore power like armor sat still, his eyes lowered, his shoulders sagged. For the first time, he didn't push back. No rebuttal, no counter-accusation, no scoff. Elise looked at him. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't falter, but it cut through the stillness with the precision of someone who's been waiting far too long to speak the truth. "You almost killed a child you never even laid eyes on." The silence that followed felt stretched across the room like a wire pulled taut. A few people closed their eyes. Some reporters lowered their pens. It was as if the courtroom itself had stopped breathing. After her testimony, Elise didn't return to her seat. She turned to the DOJ representatives and requested permission to submit an addendum. When granted, she stepped back to the podium, this time holding a thin folder, compact but filled with systemic reform proposals. "I didn't come here seeking revenge," she began. "I came because I believe that this pain, this failure, must be converted into something more than a media headline. I am here to propose 3 specific solutions." She held the document high. 1. All on-duty police officers must be equipped with body cameras embedded with independent AI oversight. Technology programmed to detect abusive behavior patterns without relying on internal reviews. 2. Establish a civilian advisory board with the authority to recommend demotion or dismissal of officers found in ethical violation. 3. Create a program called We Were There, in which individuals wrongfully detained are invited to recount their experiences directly to newly inducted officers, as part of mandatory ethics and civil rights training. Each proposal was presented not as a plea, but as a surgical plan to address a social illness, offered with the clarity and precision of a physician who had spent years diagnosing the symptoms of a system in failure. Elise was no longer confronting a man who once humiliated her. She was beginning to draft a new route for an institution long thought untouchable. After she spoke, she stepped down, her gaze catching briefly with Shaw's. He nodded, not out of agreement, but in respect. Marshal Monroe stood waiting at the end of the corridor, his coat slipping slightly off one shoulder. He said nothing, only lifted a single thumb as Elise passed. The outcome of that hearing wasn't a verdict, it was a signal. Another trial would come. The next phase of the investigation would open. But from that moment forward, America no longer saw Elise Monroe as someone wrongfully detained. They saw her as someone who laid the foundation for a different future, where courage isn't just defined by standing up after a blow, but by turning that blow into a shield for those still vulnerable. A victim had stepped forward as an architect, a doctor who didn't only save lives in an OR, but who had begun dissecting a system that never intended to let her hold the scalpel in the first place. 2 weeks after the initial hearing, The official indictment from the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia was released. It listed multiple charges against former officer Trent Malloy: abuse of authority during official duty, infliction of serious bodily harm upon a civilian, obstruction of emergency medical practice, and violation of civil rights under the 14th Amendment. At sentencing, Malloy appeared in a worn black suit, no longer carrying the posture of the man who once strode into Elise's holding cell. His attorney pleaded for leniency, citing job stress and a misunderstood situation. But in court, the video captured by the young black boy in the pharmacy, authenticated by the DOJ, became irrefutable evidence of intent, contempt, and a sustained pattern of intimidation. Judge Margaret Kilner did not read the verdict in a mechanical voice. She paused at each count and delivered her ruling with resolute clarity. You used a position granted by the state to oppress, humiliate, and strip a citizen of her ability to practice urgent medical care, because that citizen did not share your skin color. The courtroom fell into silence. Elise sat still in the front row, hands folded in her lap, her expression absent of anger, only bearing witness to a structure collapsing under the weight of justice. For these actions, the defendant, Trent Malloy, is sentenced to 13 years in federal correctional custody with no eligibility for parole during the first 8. Upon release, the defendant is permanently barred from employment in law enforcement and from holding any public administrative position involving civilian oversight. And then she paused, her eyes sharp as a scalpel's edge. All records of the defendant's police service will be transferred to the Federal Administrative Misconduct Archive as a standing memorandum to future generations. Power without integrity leaves only ruin. Malloy did not react, his face drained, jaw clenched, hands trembling as federal marshals stepped forward and snapped cuffs around his wrists. As he stepped down from the platform, the bow of his head, once withheld for years, finally appeared. Not from remorse, but because everything he had buried was now exposed in daylight. And in that moment, justice was no longer an abstraction or a promise written into law. It was a living presence, with a name, a voice, a mind, and blood. Her name was Elise Monroe. 7 weeks after Malloy's sentencing, in a modest room behind Emmanuel Baptist Church on East 39th Street, an old oak bench sat at the center of the gathering space. It wasn't elevated, cushioned, or engraved, but everyone there referred to it with a kind of reverence. The bench for dignity. Elise Monroe was the first to sit on it. She didn't teach. She didn't deliver a speech. She told a story, calmly and slowly. The story of that night in the pharmacy was no longer about blaming anyone. It was about letting those seated around her know they weren't alone. Wounds, if hidden, will fester. But when shared in the right place at the right time, they could become part of something healing. Beneath the soft yellow lights, a middle-aged man named Malik recounted being pulled from his car for failing to signal, though he'd been parked. A brown-skinned mother held a photo of her son and said he was once detained for 14 hours because he fit a description. A young woman, just 17, clutching a student folder from her pre-med program, said with a trembling voice, "I'm studying medicine because I want to save lives, but also because I want there to be a day when a black female doctor stands in the middle of a hospital and people see her as the one in charge, not someone who wandered in by mistake." Elise sat silently for a moment, then stepped forward to hug her. No words followed. That embrace was enough for 2 generations to silently nod in unity. From that day forward, the Bench for Dignity became a weekly event. Elise declined every TV appearance, podcast interview, and talk show invitation. Requests from publishers and national media outlets arrived nearly daily, but all were met with the same polite but unwavering response: "I don't need a microphone to be heard." I just need no one else to stand alone in front of a system the way I did. Instead, she spent her time in the operating room of a community hospital, guiding med students during clinical rounds, correcting how they held a scalpel, explaining every movement with care. She never failed to mention the night she was denied the right to practice medicine, not to provoke anger, but to instill awareness. Every medical action is a declaration of life, and it must be defended. One late evening after a sharing session, as most had already gone, Elise heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Jolene, the pharmacy manager from that night, the woman who had called the police, who had once pursed her lips and called Elise one of those impersonators. Jolene stood with hunched shoulders, gripping her purse strap. Her face was no longer rigid, but lined with visible regret. "I know I don't deserve to be here," she said, voice rasping with emotion. "I believed what people whispered about you. I thought the following procedure was enough, but when I saw you being led out, bleeding, I knew I was wrong." The room fell silent. Some turned to Elise. No one interrupted. Elise didn't back away. She looked at Jolene for a long time as if searching her eyes for something truer than an apology. "I forgive you," Elise said, her voice steady, "but I won't forget. And because I won't forget, I'll do everything I can to make sure no one else has to endure what I did." That sentence echoed through the room like a statement not meant for a single person, but for the entire city. No applause followed. People simply stood, one by one, and sat beside Jolene, not to excuse her, but to ensure she didn't sit alone. Forgiveness is a beginning, but action is the proof. A week later, 6 medical and law schools across Georgia signed a memorandum to integrate the Bench for Dignity into first-year orientation, not for inspiration, but because it made plain what law books never say. Dignity must be upheld, even when the world stays silent. Marshall Monroe attended one of those sessions, seated quietly in the back, watching his daughter step forward to speak. He didn't need to say a word. He knew that the woman the system once tried to silence had now begun rebuilding it, starting with the very first brick. And that oak bench, sitting in the center of that small, simple room, bearing no plaque, no founder's name, had become a quiet witness to a transformation powered not by authority, but by truth, spoken aloud again and again, until society could no longer ignore it. To Elise Monroe, justice was never just a verdict. Justice was every moment someone stood up and said, "I was humiliated, but I'm still here." And that was how she turned the pain into seed, not for vague hope, but for persistent action. The story of Elise Monroe didn't end with a verdict or a ceremony. It ends where real justice begins. A hospital corridor, a promise kept, a successful surgery, and a child still alive. Elise didn't become a hero because of what she took back from the system, but because she dared to return to the very place that once denied her, and do what was right without needing anyone's approval. She showed America that justice isn't always a loud fight. Sometimes it's simply a moment when a black woman is allowed to do her job without suspicion, without obstruction, and without needing permission to exist. And what about you? Have you ever seen someone be judged unfairly because of the color of their skin or where they came from? Share that story in the comments. If this journey moved you, share, and subscribe so that voices like Elise's, quiet but relentless, are never drowned out again.